The investigation into Russia meddling in last year's election, well, it's perhaps taking a bit of a pivotal turn. According to Politico, President Trump's legal team may offer special counsel Robert Mueller an interview with the president in an attempt to accelerate the ongoing investigation. The report goes on to say that if Mueller does not request an interview by Thanksgiving, the president's attorneys could potentially take matters into their own hands by making the offer of an interview with Mr. Trump themselves. So what does all this mean for the investigation? Let's bring in Niall Stanage, White House columnist for The Hill. Niall, first of all, one of the president's lawyers, John Dowd, he calls this report from Politico, quote, totally false, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Three of them. So what are you hearing this afternoon?
Well, when it's a three exclamation point denial, I think that has to be taken pretty seriously, Eric. But in all seriousness, I have done some digging into this myself, and what I am hearing is that there have not been discussions among President Trump's legal team about this idea of an interview with Bob Mueller. Now, obviously, the Politico report is very different from that. Politico has not stepped away from that reporting. So I think what we're seeing here are different, perhaps, agendas at play within the president's legal team. Yeah,
I mean, you talk about different agendas, maybe. Adam Schiff, ranking Democrat on the House Intel Committee, looking into this. I mean, he's in the Washington Post saying he thinks that the White House, he says, and others are trying to rush this, to get it wrapped up and basically, skip over justice in his view.
Yes, and I think it's interesting that a Democrat is making this argument because, of course, nothing about the Mueller probe can really be completely separated from its political dimension. This is something that casts a long political shadow over the White House. That shadow is a problem whether any wrongdoing is eventually alleged or not. And so Democrats have an interest, I think, in prolonging this inquiry. Republicans and the White House in particular have an interest in it coming to a close, so long, of course, as no wrongdoing is proven.
Yeah, the president, of course, is on the record as saying he's 100% willing, to testify. Let me read you a paragraph from the Politico report about all this. It says, quote, the White House believes such an interview could help Mueller wrap up the probe faster and dispel the cloud of suspicion over Trump. Trump's lawyers could push to limit the time and scope of any interview with Mueller and also ask for advanced details about what kinds of topics and documents would be raised. Trump also could seek exemptions from questions by citing executive and attorney-client privilege. So it's not at all clear what could be accomplished. And the president's already on the record saying there's been no collusion with the Russians. He had nothing to do with the Russians. He doesn't know anything about all this.
Yes, and I think that's one of the reasons why there may be this willingness to have such an interview. I think that from a political perspective, rather than a legal one, trying to avoid an interview creates the impression of having something to hide. The president has said he doesn't have anything to hide, that there is no wrongdoing. So I think just on a common sense basis, it makes political sense to try to be as open as possible, to be willing to testify, as he has said, and as he insists, try to clear this matter up.
Yeah, and in terms of clearing it up, I mean, what if this is not at all, about him? There's a grand jury. We know that. That's been reported. And you've got Paul Manafort, former chairman of the campaign, and General Michael Flynn. I mean, man, oh, man, they've been in hot water. So what if, could Mueller and his team then potentially interview the president on behalf of an investigation of them?
Absolutely. Just because the president may be interviewed does not necessarily guarantee that he himself is a target or that he is himself under suspicion. It could well be the case that his testimony is being sought for some of these other matters that you have just mentioned, Eric. And I think there is, in fact, precedent for past presidents being interviewed by legal officials in exactly that way, as part of investigations into other people.
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned that. Bill Clinton, remember Monica Lewinsky, they took the grand jury videotape testimony in the White House, when he was talking about the definition of the word is. Ronald Reagan, I recall, testified before the Iran-Contra committee, and we've had at least two Former White House officials testify already behind closed doors. Apparently, the reports say Reince Priebus, former chief of staff, was there on Friday. So we don't know exactly what they testified to. But as you said, there is precedence. And what is, if we remember back to Bill Clinton, what would be the political impact of this if it were to eventually come to pass, that the president would be sitting down? Would that be something that we would see and would be released like the videotape of Bill Clinton?
My understanding is that that would be a process of negotiation, as I believe it was in former President Clinton's case, Eric. Now, in his case, in Clinton's case, obviously that became problematic, to say the very, very least. We simply don't know in President Trump's case what he would be testifying, whether he would be testifying under oath even, or whether it would be a more informal interview. So it's not necessarily a bad thing politically for him to do this in any respect. If his assertions of innocence are true and accurate, I think it makes political sense and common sense to do this.
Yeah, I mean, Hillary Clinton, when she testified, was called in to talk about the billing records of the Rose law firm and all that were suddenly mysteriously somehow found in the White House. Remember, they were missing? And they were hidden away in a closet. Supposedly, she came out, she testified, then came out in front of the microphones and, of course, said how she was basically, I'm paraphrasing, so grateful and willing to tell the truth and try to, clear the air. And that was an opportunity back at that time for the First Lady to try to put that side forward, that she was being forthcoming and completely honest to in her testimony.
Yes, a position that she came to somewhat belatedly in many people's view, Eric. And I think this goes to the very point that we're discussing. In Hillary Clinton's case, and this isn't even a partisan point, the delay in that issue, or this suspicion that records were being kept and then mysteriously showed up at an opportune moment, I think built or added to the cloud of suspicion. Now, if you can avoid that, if you can portray yourself as being forthcoming, as willing to answer questions, then I think that does lessen or reduce that cloud to some extent. We live in very partisan times. Many people are going to continue to be suspicious. But just in terms of political strategy, it is better to be presenting oneself as forthcoming.
And finally now, quickly, I mean, how do you think this will play out? Do you think the president will be, put under oath?
I think it's certainly possible. I mean, Bob Mueller is clearly a very serious investigator. This is a very serious matter. But again, I would just highlight the fact that being put under oath and being suspected of wrongdoing are two separate things.
Yep, and he's been tweeting about it, so we'll just have to see. Niall Stanage, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Of course.